Welcome to another edition of Down the Road. We're going to talk to an individual a little bit later, Sarah Buxbaum, and Sarah is a consumer service expert. We're going to talk about the judge's decision to say, you know what, if you hop on that plane, no more need to wear a mask, and how this is all shaking out, whether or not there's public safety issues at play here, or whether or not it was time. I know many of you think it was time, and other individuals that were mask advocates for a long time have said, what's the problem? So we'll get into that a little bit later. But I had a chance to meet Kari Odermann through my radio show and to read about her prior to that. A number of people called me and said, hey, you've got to hear about this woman. That's amazing. She was an anchor in Ukraine. She's a journalist. She went to Dickinson State. I'm not going to make that mistake ever again, to not mention DSU, and then on to the University of North Dakota. So there's a huge footprint here in North Dakota. Let's bring her in. Kari Odermann, good to have you coming down the road with us.
Thanks a lot. Let's see where this conversation leads us down the road.
Yeah, exactly. So your family now in Germany, if you could, let's take a step back to being in Ukraine and going to Germany. Explain to the audience exactly what's happened in your life.
Well, after leaving North Dakota an awful long time ago, I got involved in humanitarian work, and I work in a lot of good governance projects. And after living in Germany and meeting my husband there, I went on to live in India for a couple years. And in 2018, we moved to the Ukrainian capital in Kyiv. And we were there until mid-February when, on the advice of the US Embassy and later also the German Embassy, it was a good thing that we got out of there. We were able to leave the country before the bombs actually started falling. But we still did experience a lot of the uncertainty about what was going to happen to us, if we were going to be safe, and we had to leave rather quickly.
And you found your way to Germany. What's it like to pick up a family and just realize that in that one day your life changes? This was your home. I mean, if somebody told you tomorrow, or told me tomorrow, that, you know what, the area that you live and have lived in for quite some time and are raising children, and that's no longer going to be your home, that there's bombs on the way, and by the way, good luck to you, head out. You know, I can't imagine what that was like, Kari.
You can do it if you must. Maybe it's in our genetics, though, a little bit. Where my grandfather grew up is now under Lake Sakakawea. You know, he grew up in Elbow Woods. A lot of us also have grandparents that talk about coming over from the old country. They talk about things that they cherish. You know, I'm sitting here talking with you, and I've got this case for my glasses. It's pretty, it's girly. I'm glad I thought to grab that, but that just happened to be in my purse. We grabbed hard drives with family pictures. We didn't bother with photo albums. It was cold. It was winter in Ukraine, which is a lot like winter in North Dakota, but you're still having winter now. I've been watching the news reports. You had a great blizzard just there. So we actually, a lot of the space that we had available was winter survival stuff, because we didn't know how long the infrastructure was going to hold. When we were told to leave, we didn't know if the invasion was going to start, if infrastructure was going to no longer be available to us. So we had to make sure that we could also hoof it out of there. So we had our Carhartt snow pants and things like that with us, hiking boots. The pets were along.
How do you,
priorities.
How do you keep track of the place? I mean, how do you, I have some friends right now that are down in Florida. They only contacted 3 different families to make sure that their place is looking out for, along with a security system. And so how do you keep track of this place you call home?
I don't. I had a journalist friend that went back to Kyiv from Lviv about 2 weeks ago. He knew where I live, walked past. We're on a 3rd floor of an old house that was built in the 1800s in downtown Kyiv. We feel safe because we're near a lot of the World Heritage sites, and we lived where a lot of the embassies were. So we're hoping that that won't be bombed. If it's looted, there's really nothing we can do about that. And it is what it is. I could dwell on it. I could talk about how, there was a print that my dad got from an artist named Kay Burian that had a Western theme on it, Little Lost Calf. And my sister wanted this picture so badly. And I talked my mom out of it because I said, you know what, I live far away. Give me a piece of North Dakota. And my sister called me up and said, did you leave that picture there? I said, I'm sorry, I did. I left a lot of other things too. So we try to have fun with this because there's no point in overthinking it. It is what it is.
You said something to me that, I don't know, it stuck into my head when we were visiting on the radio, which was things you wish you had done aside from those personal items before you left. And one of the things you talked about was groceries.
Yeah, I wish I would have known that we weren't coming back because I had a lot of noodles, chickpeas, canned goods. In Ukraine, if someone wants to show love, they bring things from their garden. I had pickles and tomatoes and vinegar from anyone I know that had a garden that, they'd bring a jar over when they were invited. And that was really hard on me because I knew there was a time when food was getting a little bit short in Kyiv. Now, we've all seen the pictures from the suburbs north of the capital and what happened in Bucha. So it was never quite that bad, but they did have some problems just, getting food to people. And I was sad because I thought, what a waste. But my landlady, the stubborn Ukrainian that she was in the city for about 3 weeks before her daughter finally convinced her, Mom, you've got to go. And she's in Bulgaria. So she went over to water my plants and check things out. And she texted me saying, I hope you're not mad, but I took all of your food and gave it to your neighbor who's cooking for the neighborhood. I was so thankful. But there's another thing I wish I would have done. We unplugged our routers and Wi-Fi. And a lot of times communication is really, really important for displaced people. And if I would have been thinking, I would have taken the password off of my Wi-Fi and just let people that go past my house find it so they could use it for communication. But that's kind of like an advanced level thing. I was glad the food wasn't wasted.
Yeah. Well, I can understand what you're getting at. And, stealing Wi-Fi is something that I'm very familiar with. So, I understand what you're getting at because it can be incredibly useful. I want to talk to you about Kyiv itself, about Ukraine. I want to visit with you about the things that we as North Dakotans might not realize. And that is similarities, that is lifestyles, that is how you were living your life. If you can just walk people through that, Kari.
When you are in Kyiv, you might as well just be surrounded by North Dakotans in some way. There is a Northern European, Scandinavian, kind of a German mix of culture and people. Food is very important. Respect for personal space, friendliness, but at the same time, not being overbearing. A sense for, and this really occurs to me now that I'm in Germany where things always function optimally. Not everything always goes right, and you figure it out together. And if you're looking for a parking spot and you end up parking someone in, you put your number and on a sheet of paper, and they'll call you and they'll say, hey, I need to move my car. And then you work it out amongst yourselves rather than everyone following rules. Rules aren't followed too well there. It's a question of enforcement, and it's also a question of just having the resources to, are you going to enforce parking or not? It reminds me a lot of North Dakota. And North Dakota has such a strong tie to Ukraine in terms of landscape and culture. And the last major wave of immigrants from Europe came from Ukraine just before the First World War.
Yeah, I think that people don't realize here in North Dakota the footprint that Ukraine has, right down to, places of worship, right down to the culture, right down to still family ties. As you mentioned, being some of the last people that came, there's a closer relationship to it. In regards to how many steps or how many generations away. I have to ask you this. In finding out and following through the media from the Ukrainian people, I seem to notice something in terms of, we've talked about the quality, the defense of the country. We've talked about the endurance, about the resolve, all of that. But just simply, for lack of a better way of putting it, understanding of the advancement of the culture, the education. There are people in Ukraine that speak better English than I speak English. And so it was a little bit shocking to me how advanced it is because of images that one might have had, Kari.
Okay, but there's a great deal of diversity in Ukraine too. There are still people that have outhouses and live in very small villages and don't have a lot of infrastructure and access to things. However, education is a very, very important thing to Ukrainians. And they are able to speak different languages. But Joel, I got to tell you, it's not only Ukraine that's like that. I think we're a little bit behind in the United States. Being able to speak a couple languages, isn't that off? Isn't that, it's not too extraordinary. But the people in Ukraine, what we've been watching now in the past, we're 50 plus days into this war. One of the things that stands out the most to me is just this bravery, though, this stoicism. So, yeah, some of them can speak really good languages, but there's certain things you can't learn in school, like this love of freedom and liberty, and to be so brave. And that's something I'm watching from afar now, going, I can't believe it. It's amazing.
We talked in the last segment about the resolve and the bravery of the Ukrainian people, and if you could just speak to that, this is the best way for me to ask it, was it surprising to you at all?
Yes. Nobody thought this was going to happen. US, UK, their intelligence services had been saying there was a lot of chatter, a lot of talk. They started pulling out the diplomats and the non-essential people early February, but you've got to protect the people that are serving the countries. And if they're non-essential and there's kids and families, we just watched that and we said, okay, we can understand why they're doing this. They're playing it safe. And no one thought that the invasion was going to happen like it did. There were several scenarios, and we know that Russia needs access to its warm water port that it has in the occupied Crimea, which it illegally annexed in 2014. So there was always that idea of going through Mariupol in southeastern Ukraine, through the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk republics, and taking that and connecting that land bridge. But the idea that they would come down through the Chernobyl region into Kyiv, get to Gostomel Airport, do what they did in Bucha and the surrounding communities, no one thought that was going to happen. And we're still as a family, friends, colleagues, we're still working through that. This is a reality that we're faced with. It's not easy.
Okay. Well, let me ask one more that ties into that. The Ukrainian people themselves, the resolve they have, the people that were willing to put on that camouflage and pick up that weapon and be there on the front line. And, when you hear some individuals that are in a position that they can't win, they're in a box and they tell the Russian army to go blank itself. That's a group of individuals that are fearless in so many ways. Did you see that? Did you know that about the Ukrainian people and where you live?
I was interested in learning about the Revolution of Dignity, which took place in 2014, which really pitted simple Ukrainians. And in 2014, you had everyone out in the barricades in central Kyiv fighting against a really corrupt government. And I would hear stories about that. Or, if you're in a managerial position and you're hiring young people and you notice that there's a gap in their CV, 2013, 2014, and nothing was happening in their life, you ask them what they did, and you would hear the most amazing stories. A friend of mine's, her name is Sasha, she said, people were going missing during the Revolution of Dignity, and there was no way to centralize a list. So I just started doing Excel sheets, and I became the person in charge of all the missing people. Or the stories of young men saying, my mom didn't want me to go down to the Maidan where the main revolution was happening, but I volunteered in some of the public buildings which were made into makeshift hotels, hospitals, pardon me. So I had learned about this and heard about these people willing to participate and be proactive, but seeing it now, Joel, you talked about people willing to put camouflage on, but it's just not people willing to put camouflage on. We've seen them making the Molotov cocktails. We've seen them filling sandbags. We've seen just everyday people, showing symbols of defiance. And they, how if you take a political science class in college or maybe in high school, they talk about how one vote makes a difference and how everyone needs to cast their vote. And there's always a long list of examples, of historical examples, where major things happen because of one vote. And I think this thinking has gone over into the Ukrainian mindset of how one person can make a difference. There are members of a battalion right now in Mariupol, sorry, and some journalists have been in contact with them. And it doesn't look good for the soldiers in Mariupol right now. Sorry, Joel.
No, that's okay. I mean, this is the life you're living right now. I mean, this is the life you're living. There are journalists that that are no longer with us. And so I can't imagine it. I mean, I just can't imagine it.
And it's hearing these stories, and this journalist in particular, a guy named Simon Schuster, he's the one that originally broke the story for Vice News in 2014, saying that those are Russians that are illegally annexing Crimea. So this journalist has a pretty good, an excellent reputation when it comes to covering things about Ukrainian-Russian conflict. And he was in touch with a soldier in Mariupol. And obviously he's well connected because of his experience. And a young guy, he said, I'm wounded. I'm not doing good. But if we hold these soldiers here, that keeps other cities free. So that's what they're doing. Yeah.
Think about that. From the standpoint of NATO, and you earlier in our interview, there were signs, and those signs depicted Vladimir Putin to be exactly what I think he is. So we'll get into that, and where you see this going with a man like Vladimir Putin and his resolve. But there was also clearly signs that believe that NATO should be providing that air support, that NATO should be helping in that way. And clearly they're not, and they're not going to. What's the perception with the friends that you have that you're still communicating with of NATO in Ukraine?
I think they've got to be pragmatic. I think they're just moving on. They're thinking right now about the Iron Dome in Israel, which would really also accomplish a lot. If you're not going to do a no-fly zone, you get an Iron Dome situation like in Israel, which you can have this mobilized unit that, it doesn't let cruise missiles come in. That's an option. The thing that's frustrating for me is NATO is going to still come out of this as a winner, and for have done really nothing, for having led Ukraine along for a very long time, having said behind Ukraine's back, quietly, that they were never thinking about really letting them in. But now Finland and Sweden, two very well-trained, well-equipped militaries, are thinking about joining the treaty organization. On top of that, NATO can look very generous by passing on armaments that it would have gotten rid of in a couple of years anyhow, just because they're 10, 15 years old. And thanks to Vladimir Putin, NATO has now a member, Germany, which has completely changed its mindset about military spending and will be investing so much more that there's a story from World War II about how there were Polish partisans in Warsaw, I believe, fighting against the Nazis. and they were waiting for backup from Russian soldiers, Soviet soldiers at the time. And Russia sat there and watched them kill each other, and then came down only when the fighting was done, because it played to their advantage. And very critical people could look at NATO also having this advantage, because the more Russian soldiers that Ukrainians kill, the more tanks, the more armored personnel carriers that are destroyed by Ukrainians, NATO benefits in the long run. It's a sad truth to watch, but I think Ukraine has now moved on from that, and they have to think in the moment. And with a Jewish president in Ukraine, it would make sense that their ties to Israel might be a little bit closer than they are. Now, Israel's being really careful, but Israel does have the resources to save more Ukrainian lives by having like an air shield like the Iron Dome.
As an American, you know, as a citizen of the United States, trying to peel back that veil of everything you know about Ukraine, and with the knowledge and the intellect that you have, if in fact you would have been that U.S. citizen, what you would have thought of how our role is.
You know, the United States in the last 20, 30 years has really been changing how it views its own role in the world. So I'm not sure if I wouldn't have had any of my time that I had in Ukraine, how would I react to that? I'm a person that doesn't think the United States should go it alone. I think there should be international consensus building. And I don't think the United States should go it alone here in Ukraine. One of the biggest propaganda narratives here is that the Ukraine is just a proxy for a U.S. conflict with the Kremlin. And of course, the United States is involved indirectly, but I think it makes it too easy of an argument to say this is the United States trying to shape the international world. I'd like to see some more. We have to have some hard discussions about where America is going to go. And we should have had these discussions in 2014. We should have had them when Crimea was annexed the first time. And where do we stand with international law? And how are we going to react as a member of the international community when things happen?
Well, communications being what they are, I have absolutely no doubt that you, being a journalist by your very nature, that you have a very good understanding of what's happening in media here in the U.S., which has drawn a lot of passion. The little lake I live by, Kari, you can drive by, and every morning I drive by and see a Ukrainian flag. And you see people constantly wearing Ukrainian clothes and wearing the buttons. And so it's here. The passion is here. That being said, I'm not sure if I stop at any one of those places and said to them or asked them if they understood what was asked by the Ukrainian people to get their independence, what the Ukrainian people had to give up in terms of being able to defend themselves against anything. I'm not sure they'd know. And
oh no, yeah,
I'm not sure they'd know.
In 1994, when Bill Clinton was president, there was a meeting in Budapest, and that's when the Budapest Memorandum was signed. And basically, it comes down to the fact that in 1994, Ukraine was still a struggling, nascent nation. I mean, it's got a long history of being an independent nation, but after so many years of Soviet oppression, I'm going to use that word on purpose, they had to develop a sense of civic, cultural identity again, and an understanding of what it means to be a nation in this modern landscape. So they didn't have the resources to keep the nuclear warheads, which were dotting the Ukrainian landscape, safe. And this was very concerning for all of the international community. So the Budapest Memorandum was pretty much like saying, we'll take these off your hands. We're going to take the nuclear warheads. We're going to make sure that nothing goes wrong with them. And we promise you we're going to keep you safe. And you also have to keep in mind the nuclear codes weren't in Ukrainian hands. They only had the hardware, not the software to fire the weapons. But they gave up major leverage by handing the actual warheads over. And it was a memorandum, but actually it was never discussed how the agreement in the memorandum would be enforced. And now we're in the situation we're in right now.
Yeah. And we put them in that position. We did. And by we, I say a league of nations, or at least a group of nations. And NATO said, look, we can do this, which then placated an evil man like Vladimir Putin. That being said, I'm not sure nuclear weaponry in Ukraine would have deterred him at all, because the only reason to be afraid of it is what it's going to do to your people, and I'm not sure he cares about his people. I'm really not. When it comes to Vladimir Putin, and from the outside looking in, understanding the culture, what's your take on the man himself and the world's understanding versus the Ukrainian people's understanding of how evil this man is?
Well, he is extremely intelligent and knows a lot about human psychology. And it's not a coincidence that the soldiers that he's recruited for this campaign in Ukraine come from very rural areas where they don't have a lot of access to information, may not be well educated, and may not have, any amenities at home. We're talking about really simple, think of homesteading type of situations from what we had here in Dakota 100 years ago plus. And getting these young men, putting good boots on their feet, putting uniforms on them, and telling them that, they're going to go and do something, they're going to be welcomed, and, just to follow orders. There's a reason that he chose those people to do this. And he also is very good at not only controlling people that maybe don't have a lot of access to information, but also controlling people that have access to information, because he knows how to twist that too. So Vladimir Putin is a really very smart person. I don't think he's a nice guy. I wouldn't want to go on vacation with him. If he's evil, the thing is, everyone thinks they're doing the right thing. You've been in politics for a long time, and everyone thinks that we have to accept that there's lots of different roads that lead to Rome, right? And if everyone wants to do something good, what we define as something good is where the differences is. He thinks he's doing the right thing for the Russian people and Russia's place in the world order. That the rest of us don't agree, it's clear. But I think he thinks he's doing the right thing.
Kari, how does this end?
I tell you what's going to make me really frustrated. In 6 or 9 months, when people are saying, if only we would have done something 6 or 9 months ago. We're at the point right now where everyone's talking about World War III, and we don't need World War III. We've got a repeat of World War II right now. And there, everyone knew it was wrong and was proactive. So I don't think we need to worry about World War III. We should just stop World War II from happening again.
Yeah, agreed. Kari, like I said, I could do this all day. Keep your family safe. And know this, North Dakota would be a better place if you just called that home. So don't be afraid to pack a bag and just get here, okay?